This is chapter 2 of my conversation with Professor Norman Finkelstein. He is a historian, political scientist, and the author of over 10 books, including The Holocaust Industry, Gaza, and Inquest Into Its Martyrdom, and I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It. In this conversation, we pick up from where we left off in the first conversation, so I highly recommend you check out the first chapter. It will provide a lot of the context and nuance that's necessary for following along with this conversation. But here we talk about the state of politics, especially American politics, and the ease or difficulty of finding hope and optimism in the midst of it. We continue our exploration of the great man theory and how much agency the leader of Israel has, or Benjamin Netanyahu has, as compared to the public sentiment. We also cover the historical context of the background behind Zionism. What is Zionism? Is there any utility in having an ethno-nationalist state or a Jewish state? We also cover the divide between the West Bank and Gaza, the history of the Palestine Liberation Organization and Yasser Arafat. And then we also talk about the future of Gaza. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project takes a lot of my time, money, and effort. And now it's officially my full-time job. I've retired from a corporate job and I'm pursuing this full-time. So if you want to see this continue, now more than ever, please consider supporting it. Please consider making a donation on Patreon or Anchor. You can buy Super Thanks on YouTube. You can join as a member on YouTube, or you can buy gifts on Instagram Reels. If not through monetary channels, then do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments. All forms of engagement, they really go a long way. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And now, it's no time. In English literature class in high school, we were taught a short story by William Wymark Jacobs called The Monkey's Paw. And the premise was this old couple receives a dried monkey's paw and it's considered a talisman, which will grant your wishes. They wish for 200 pounds and immediately there's a knock on the door and there's a person from the company that the son works for. And he says, your son has died in an accident at work and here's 200 pounds as bereavement payment from the company. The couple quickly finds out that the monkey's paw will grant your wish, but not in the way you want it to be granted. Careful what you wish for. This is what engaging in politics feels like to me, especially American politics. Every cycle, every election cycle, leaders run campaigns on big promises and big ideas. But when they get into office, when it's time to execute on these ideas, they try to accomplish them in ways that you don't want it to be accomplished. A good recent example is Trump ran a campaign on peace and he flexed his record of no new wars in his previous term. But the moment he got into office, his way of ending the war in Ukraine is by bullying Zelensky in the White House and alienating an ally. His way of ending the genocide in Gaza is by asking the population to leave, by displacing the entire population and putting out a video, an offensive video titled Trump Gaza. His way of ending the war in Iran is by attacking Iran and then bullying them into submission. Now, in theory or in hindsight, all of these will end the war, but not in the fashion that we want it to end. And it goes beyond war as well. His idea of improving the economy is by imposing tariffs and alienating allies. It's just one giant monkey's paw. You've studied politics for over 50 years. So I want to start by seeking your advice on how to navigate politics, because it's getting increasingly difficult to avoid pessimism, cynicism, and nihilism. Has it always been like this? Has it always been this frustrating, this depressing, so seemingly pointless? Are we stuck in an infinite loop, or do you think this is a unique, special period?
Well, there are reasons for hope and there are reasons for despair. Every time we sink into despair, suddenly a new hope emerges on the horizon. Mm-hmm. So we went through very barren times, and then when everything seemed so bleak, a septuagenarian Jewish fellow from Brooklyn who called himself a democratic socialist, went out to campaign for his ideas. And he himself, this was in 2016, he himself was shocked by the reaction, the huge groundswell of support for the Bernie Sanders campaign. In 2020, he came very close. The Democratic Party leadership proceeded to sabotage his candidacy, in particular Barack Obama, behind the scenes as the South Carolina primary came into play. The Democratic Party elite, led by Obama, proceeded to sabotage Bernie's campaign. That, of course, was a big disappointment. Then there were the George Floyd demonstrations, which were about 50% white young people. And you saw the possibilities of a real coalition between young people who are white and non-white, all of whom in our city, in our country, were facing a futureless future. Then the George Floyd demonstrations, for various reasons, didn't succeed. I can go into that later, but I won't digress now. And then when everything seemed so bleak, never bleaker, with the genocide in Gaza, then the assault, the destruction, the apparent destruction of Hezbollah, the Party of God, and then the attacks in Iran, I was focused very much on Gaza and Iran. But I hear from people these mutterings about this fellow named Zohran Mamdani. I didn't really know what to make of it. I couldn't pay enough attention to it because I was so focused on developments elsewhere. And then something absolutely thrilling happened. The billionaire class, the Upper East Side, who have only two concerns in life: making our cities safe for billionaires and making our cities safe for Israel. That's their only two concerns. They mobilized fanatically to stop Zohran Mamdani. They outspent his campaign by a minimum of 30-1. The official numbers are Mamdani was, Andrew Cuomo was given $30 million. Mamdani raised $1.2 million. And that huge constituency out there, the 80%, it's not 99%, as the Wall Street slogan, or Occupy Wall Street slogan had it. We are the 99%. It's not 99%, it's about 80%. 20% if you're in IT or in finance or in the what's called in the United States, the professions, medical, medicine, law. If you're in the professions, you're doing not just fine, you're doing a lot better than fine. But if you're not, you're facing a precarious present and a futureless future, which is about 80%. I went out in the last week campaigning for Mr. Mamdani, and there are a few revealing episodes. So I was outside a shopping mall, and 5 young women came by They were probably around 25. I gathered by their feely touchiness they were lesbians and very cheerful. So I said, oh, okay. What do you do? She said, I'm an actor. I turned to the second. What do you do? I'm a singer. I turned to the third. What do you do? I'm a writer. And then the fourth one chimed in. In other words, we're all baristas. And they all burst out laughing. In other words, the dreams are still there. The dreams are still there. But there's a huge chasm separating the dreams from the reality of this wretched system. And but there is a constituency out there, the proverbial masses. They're out there, and Zohran Mamdani tapped into that energy. I went to, as I said, in the past week I was working on the campaign. The average person was not more than 25. It was a younger crowd than Bernie. The Bernie Sanders campaign, you could say, it went into the 30s. This campaign wasn't even the 30s. It was the young people, fresh out of college and facing the reality. There's nothing there. There are no jobs. There is no affordable housing. There is nothing. But you know what? I still teach. Occasionally, I'm allowed to teach. I still occasionally teach. I don't make anything. I don't even care. The paycheck is a joke. I don't even look at it. I register when I get the check, so I can see that they're giving me my check, because everything is done through the mail, and then things get lost. But I don't even look at the amount. It's so laughable. But the young people, I teach at a city university, so it's mostly immigrant and working poor. Immigrant and working poor. The minds, it surprises me, because the iPhones, the web, destroyed the minds of young people. Catastrophic. But you know what? The minds remain nimble. In class, they're sharp. You can have really lively, intellectually challenging on a high level. So the young people, they haven't yet been zombieized by the social media. And so he tapped into that. And that's a very large constituency. It's about 80%, for example, of New York. If you can organize them and educate, those have always been the signposts of the radical movement. Organize and educate. If you can organize and educate, I still remain hopeful. I was not hopeful. Even while I was campaigning, it was very hard to tell, because we have our city is ethnically balkanized. So if you take my neighborhood, which is predominantly Jewish, I checked the results yesterday. My neighborhood went 66% Cuomo. But then if you go to Prospect Park, where I was 2 days ago, not only was it solidly, I said, if Prospect Park is representative of the city, I don't think Cuomo got a vote, because they had already voted early, and they were all Mamdani. In the black neighborhoods, because I went to an African-American neighborhood, they were Cuomo. So me doing the math, my neighborhood, hopeless, Jewish, and all, if you could have seen my mailbox, it was stuffed with campaign literature. We have to stop Mamdani, anti-Semite. We have to stop Mamdani, Muslim radical. It was crazy. So if you had judged from my neighborhood, hopeless. If you judged from the African-American neighborhoods, did not look good. If you judged from Prospect Park, it looked ridiculous. I mean, we were walking around. I said, let's find a place where people are opposed to Mamdani, because this is just too easy. So I did not think he would win. I figured, judging by the neighborhoods I was in, he would only won in one of the three neighborhoods, But there is a constituency. I've always said our most powerful weapons, we don't have the money. We don't have the institutions. We don't have the media. What we have on our side is truth and justice. And Zohran Mamdani's campaign showed that truth and justice, even in the face of a total media assault on Mamdani. I mean, the New York Times said he doesn't even deserve a place in the ballot. There's hope. There's hope. It's going to be a very tough struggle in November, but organize and educate, I think we can win.
Leon Trotsky used to say, in any war, the decisive factor is not the weapons, but the morale of the troops. So it's positive to hear that there's hope and there's some optimism, definitely an uplifting thought. There's a lot of things I want to explore with you, but first I want to close the loop on where we left off last time. So quick context, we were exploring the agency or the autonomy of a leader of Israel, or how much control Netanyahu actually has in ending the genocide in Gaza, or now maybe even the war in Iran. We spoke about the German Sonderweg theory, which implied that Germany was on a special path after World War I, after the Treaty of Versailles, the political instability, the financial instability, the fall of the Weimar Republic, which implied that Hitler was a consequence or an inevitability of the path Germany was on. And you've argued rightfully that the German people didn't necessarily know or vote for Hitler because of his stance, or because of his anti-Semitism, or because of the Holocaust, but they did want someone who was radical or ruthless. And then it's hard to predict how extreme.
I don't know if they want someone who is radical and ruthless. Look, first of all, I have to always qualify my statements based on my knowledge.
Right.
I studied the subject very closely between the years 1996 and 2000. I went through all of the available scholarly literature in English on the subject. After my parents passed, and I felt I had a good grasp of the subject, I stopped studying it, which means I have not looked at the scholarship from the last 25 years. I have to be honest, last 20 years. I have to be honest about that. But the record was pretty clear as far as I can tell. It was uncontroversial. Until the Great Depression in 1929, the Nazi Party was getting 5% of the vote, 6% of the vote. With the 29 Depression, it jumped to 18%. And the anti-Semitism in Hitler's campaign was pretty much what a British historian, Ian Kershaw, he called it was an add-on. You added it on, but that's not why people were voting. It's like, if you'll allow me, since we want to be current, it's like with the Mamdani campaign. Yes, he was Muslim, but did anyone care? Yeah, I'm sure some Muslims voted for him because he was Muslim. I'm sure there were some who did. And because he was Indian. He's Muslim, Indian, and also African. He was an Indian family in Uganda. So there are a handful of people who voted for him for that reason. Was that the main reason? Of course not. The main reason was his campaign of affordability. That was his campaign slogan. And it was the same thing with Hitler. Hitler promised that he could restore the economy. So there is no evidence that Hitler's anti-Semitism played a critical role in his rise to power. Now, once he got into power, first of all, he very quickly installed a totalitarian state. And the anti-Jewish hysteria was not actively opposed by the Germans. Germans, non-Jewish Germans, they did harbor prejudices, anti-Jewish prejudices. I don't attach great significance to that. You know why? Anybody who's honest with themselves, we all carry around prejudices about all sorts of people. So if the Germans carried around a prejudice, and maybe a little more than a prejudice against Jews, that doesn't shock me. It's when it starts crossing certain thresholds. The most indicative threshold, in 1938, a German Jew, I'm not sure if he was German, maybe he wasn't. No, he wasn't German. A Jew named Herschel Greenspan. He killed his family had been deported and dislocated. I can't remember the exact details, but the images were of a family being caught between all these conflicting forces and forced to go here, forced to go there, forced to go there. And he killed a member of the German legation in Paris, I think, if my memory is right. And then Kristallnacht happened. That's when the Nazis, it was called Kristallnacht because Nazi thugs smashed the windows of synagogues and Jewish property in general. The polls showed, because there was public opinion surveys, the Germans did not support it. They were willing. Now, why they didn't support it, it's a mixed picture. Some didn't support it because they thought it was wrong to do that to Jews. Others didn't support it because they thought that civilized nations shouldn't carry on that way. And Germans pride themselves as being the peak of European civilization, which it was in that era. In philosophy, in the arts, and everything, you went to Germany, So the Germans, up until Kristallnacht, which is the eve of World War II, up until then, you can characterize them as harboring prejudices. Not a big deal. Everybody harbors prejudices. Probably a more pronounced prejudice against Jews than other ethnic groups because they were so prominent and vulnerable. They had a double quality of being both prominent and vulnerable as a group. They represented only 1% of German society. There were 60 million Germans, and about 60 million Germans, and of those, about 1%, 600,000, were Jews. So they were exposed, what you can call an exposed minority. But the turning point seems to have come in the attitudes towards Jews. Seems to have come during World War II. It was a combination of two factors. One factor, the war was being blamed on what was called the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. And number two, the war went bad. And now the German soldiers were literally freezing to death in the Russian winter. Freezing to death. between that and the totalitarian propaganda that this was just a Judeo-Bolshevik war, the German heart hardened. It hardened to the point of stone. That's how I understand what happened in that period.
This is what we were exploring as well. The tussle between the public sentiment, what the people want, and how much agency one person has. So our discussion previously was based around this central question: is the genocide in Gaza under the control of one person, or is it the reflection of what the Israeli people want? So even if Netanyahu decides to stop the genocide overnight, will it actually stop, or will it get replaced by...
There's a consensus. The genocide in Gaza is not a state project. It is not a state project. It's a national project. If you look at, there are many polls. Israelis are probably the most polled people on God's earth. First of all, every poll showed that 95% of Israeli Jews believed that Israel was using the right amount of force or too little force in Gaza. That has been a constant since October 2023 to the present. Another poll by a reputable Israeli polling firm found that about one half of Israelis believed that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, should commit genocide in Gaza. The question put to the Israeli Jews was, if the IDF conquers a city, should the IDF kill everybody in the city? That is not an ambiguous question. That does not require consulting a dictionary. It's a very simple question. If the IDF conquers a city, should the army kill everybody in the city? 47% of Israeli Jews said yes. A subsequent poll asked the question, are there any innocents in Gaza? Civilian innocents. The result of that poll showed, this was a poll of all Israelis, including Arabs. It showed 63% said there were no innocents in Gaza. If you factor out the Arab Israelis, who overwhelmingly said there were innocents, it's about 70% of Israeli Jewish society believed there are no innocents in Gaza, which means everybody is a worthy target of being killed. So, however you look at it, through whatever lens you look at it, it's clear this is a national project, not a state project. And there's no shame about it. As you are surely aware, many Israeli soldiers post on the social media the sundry war crimes that they commit. It's not only that they are not penalized for posting these criminal acts. It's not only that they don't suffer any legal repercussions for posting these videos. It's that they post it with the certain knowledge that Israelis overwhelmingly will support those actions. They don't fear being ostracized. I mean, at the least, in the case of the Germans, they thought it was unbecoming a civilized country to carry on like this. The Israelis don't feel that kind of moral compunction. Nope.
This is what I want to explore with you. It's what I really want to do is extract what's a practical approach that a leader of Israel can take when this is a national project and when it's a public sentiment.
There's no practical approach.
I want to run a thought experiment with you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say you step into the shoes of Netanyahu or a leader of Israel, and this is a series of events that unfold. We can run it both for October 7th or even the war in Iran. I think it holds. You're the leader of the nation, and then Hamas retaliates on October 7th. Large number of Israeli civilians are killed, taken hostage. More, I think, at least from Israel's perspective, it's a much bigger blow to their PR campaign about their deterrence capacity. Hassan Nasrallah, former leader of the Hezbollah, said that this proved Israel is as weak as a spider's web. Even the war in Iran has proved that Israel's Hezbollah campaign about the Iron Dome is a massive dent to it now after the war as well. So you're the leader of this nation, and one of the big disadvantages of dividing the world into nation states is you have to cap your circle of ethics at a national level. National interest, national security is a number one priority. You work for the country, even if it affects other countries. If you don't do that, you will get replaced by someone who actually puts that priority in place. So you're the leader of the nation. The Israeli people are baying for blood. It's a national project. Their slogans and their songs and social media, that's what they're projecting. Is there a practical approach you can take where you can both do the right thing, but also appease the public in a manner that you don't lose this position where you can actually make a difference and make an impact? Is there a sweet spot to find?
No, I do not believe that. I think Israel, as a society, not as a state, Israel as a society has crossed a moral threshold. It's the culmination, it's the climax of a long history where all of these demons accumulated inside the bowels of Israel. And then October 7th gave them the license to release all of those pathological demons and to freely give vent to them. And at this point in time, I do not believe there is any possibility whatsoever, none, that you can persuade Israelis of the wrongness of their ways. That's not possible. It is an over-the-top population which has never suffered any consequences for its murderous acts, and that culture of impunity combined with the self-righteousness and the sheer racism of the Israeli society, this perverted notion of the chosen people, this notion of Jews being superior to everybody around them, the higher valuation attached to Jewish life versus non-Jewish life. In the case of Gaza life, zero valuation being attached to it, absolute zero. When you have, as has been attested to, even by the opposition leader Galon, he said Israeli soldiers, quote, kill children as a hobby. They kill the children of Gaza. That's a fact. Anybody who's read the scholarship on this subject and I have I wouldn't call it scholarship, that was an incorrect word, the human rights reports. And I have the killing of children for sport has a long history in Israel. So the notion that you can somehow persuade Israelis of the wrongness of their ways, to my thinking, is very far-fetched.
So how do you fix this? Because it seems like the number one call to action, and this is what you disagree with Piers Morgan as well, was, just remove Netanyahu and the problem will get solved. But if Israel as a nation has crossed that moral threshold...
Well, first of all, you're not going to remove Netanyahu. I was on Piers Morgan several times. And in one program, he very self-confidently said, well, the Israeli people obviously are going to remove him from office. That's for certain. I said, well, I don't believe it's for certain. And he repeated, no, it's for certain. Well, they're not going to remove him for a very simple reason. He is Israel, regardless of political alignment, regardless of religious or secular values. He rises above all of those divisions. He embodies, he incarnates Israeli society across the religious secular divide, across the political divide. He's an obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacist. And that's Israelis. Obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacists. Unabashedly so. Unabashedly so. So to remove him is to remove Israeli society. He is the reflection of that society. I don't say this gleefully, but I'll tell you something. I don't say it with a particular anguish either, because for me, Israel is not Jewish. There was what you might call a historic Jewish type. It was a type. In our concurrent culture, you might be too young to appreciate it, but it was represented in figures like Woody Allen. He was frail. He did not come across as what you might call a fighting Jew. He had the horn-rimmed glasses. He was a bit quirky.
Right.
He was clearly very creative. There was creativity pouring forth from all the pores in his body. He was a very good musician, a very good writer,
a
very good actor, film
director.
And that was a Jew. I mean, that was the Jewish type. What was his Weber's ideal type? Max Weber called the ideal type. He was the distillation of what it meant to be Jewish. That's not Israel. That's not Israel. I feel no connection at all to those people or to that society. None. So I could very freely say that is a nation of moral freaks. And it doesn't cause me anxiety that somehow I'm betraying my people. No, they are not my people. I grew up among Jews. I still live, my neighborhood is wall-to-wall Jewish. There are Iraqi Jews, there are Syrian Jews, there are Russian Jews, there's even at Ocean Parkway on the 6th floor, there is even a communist Jew. I'm only Jewish. So you can't say I'm running away from my roots, but I don't consider Israelis Jewish. They're not Jewish as I understood the term growing up. They become a freakish offspring of what it meant to be Jewish.
I want to continue exploring what it can take to snap a nation out of this conviction. But before we go there, let's take a small digression. Keeping up with the theme of our previous conversation, I'm going to continue picking your brains on questions I struggle to answer. And by every possible definition of the word, I'm a layman when it comes to knowledge of this conflict and the history of this conflict. And as any person would do, when you want to study it, you would try and find the source of the conflict, right? Try and find the foundational layer. And many paths lead me to Zionism. You just mentioned the historical context as well. And the problem now is, when you come across the source of Zionism, I find it very confusing to even find a good definition. Because on one hand, you have someone like Benjamin Netanyahu who says there's no difference between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And then on the other hand, you have Professor Noam Chomsky, who has acknowledged the principles of, let's call it, historical Zionism, but then he's clearly drawn a line separating it from, let's call it, contemporary Zionism or modern Zionism. And now there are multiple terms being thrown around. These definitions are vague and ambiguous. The links are confusing. And I know you've said in the past that you don't like talking about Zionism because it's not a practical approach. It doesn't take the conversation forward, especially when you talk about the genocide in Gaza. It detracts from it, or the two-state solution. But I think it's important, if you really want to understand the problem statement or the source of the conflict, probably have to define Zionism at some point. So what is Zionism?
Well, first of all, I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Zionism because I didn't know what it was. Zionism was not within my intellectual ken. Ken just means your range. Mm-hmm. I was steeped in radical political literature. I cared about Marx, Lenin, Mao, Stalin, Trotsky. That first bookshelf over there and the second bookshelf, all the classics, which I read many times over. I read Volume 1 of Capital 3 times. I read Volumes 2 and 3 twice each, and I felt very proud of that intellectual scaling, that intellectual mountain. Come the 1982 Lebanon War, which everybody has forgotten except if you were alive back then, it was, until fairly recently, it was as brutal as what happened in Gaza. In Lebanon, the estimates are between 15 and 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians, were killed. Hospitals were targeted, ambulances were targeted. It was up until October 7th, it was the most brutal display of Israelis' capacity for murder. And I joined a little group called Jews Against the Israeli Massacre in Lebanon, JAMAL. And the group, we had basic principles. And one of the principles, we had 4 basic principles. End the war in Lebanon, very simple things. But there were members of the group who wanted to define the group as being anti-Zionist. And I was reticent for a very simple reason. I didn't know what Zionism was. And I'm not about to label myself something unless I understood what the phenomenon was. And so I had started Princeton Graduate School in 1975. I was, I think, 20 years old at the time when I started graduate school. And I couldn't figure out a dissertation topic. So when this political dilemma arose with the group, I said, okay, I'll sit down, I'll read everything I can on the subject, and maybe I'll turn it into my doctoral dissertation. I'll have a subject. So I read, you might say voraciously, on the subject of Zionism. What is Zionism? If I were to try to define it, I would say there was in the 19th century what was called the Jewish question. The animus that was directed against Jews and the seeming incapacity for nation states to overcome that animus towards Jews. And it took various forms. There was the famous Dreyfus case in France. A French captain named Alfred Dreyfus, he was Jewish, and he was accused of being a spy for the Germans. And there was a famous trial, and the trial was a miscarriage of justice. I mention that because France was the home of what you might call liberal nationalism. It supposedly, or it purported to be willing to absorb everybody in its midst who was willing to commit themselves to being a citizen of France. But Jews became citizens. They became good citizens. They even became patriotic citizens like Dreyfus. But it seemed as if France was unable or unwilling to assimilate them, to take them in as an undifferentiated citizen of French society. And then in Eastern Europe, the picture was obviously much more bleak with the explosion of pogroms against Jews in the late 19th century. In fact, all the great, what were called aliyahs, that's the immigration of Jews from Europe to Palestine. There was what was called a first aliyah, a second aliyah, and a third aliyah. And each aliyah is the Hebrew word for ascending. So you're like ascending when a Jew goes to Palestine. Each aliyah coincided with another outbreak of pogroms, these state-sponsored riots of Jews in Eastern Europe. So there was the Jewish question, this inability of Jews to, quote unquote, assimilate into the nation states of Europe, Western, Central, and Eastern Europe. And there were various solutions put forth. If you're a member of the communist or anarchist left, you believe the answer was a socialist revolution, that the Jewish question was a product of capitalist society. And if you can eliminate capitalist society, you'll eliminate the oppression of Jews. Then there were groups like what were called the Bund, B-U-N-D. And they wanted to preserve Jewish ethnicity or Jewish nationality, but they wanted to preserve it within the countries where they lived. You know, sort of like a form of ethnic nationalism within a state. You know, I can give you 100 examples. You take our northern neighbor, there's Canada. The Quebecois are part of Canada, but they preserve their cultural identity. They preserve their language of French. So you're within the state, but you preserve your ethnic identity. Obviously, Spain is another example, the Basque and the other nationalities in Spain, Catalans. That was the Bund. And then there was a third group, very small, tiny, infinitesimal. They were called Zionists. And they believed that it was impossible for Jews to assimilate within the nation states of Europe, that it was normal for every nationality to have its own state. And Jews being a nationality, they should form their own independent state, and the state should be located in their what was called ancestral homeland, which was Palestine. So, in its concept, Palestine was, Zionism was pretty harmless. I don't like the idea of dividing peoples into their national identities. I still believe in the idea of one world, one people, one humanity. But if the Zionists had packed their bags and gone off to some abandoned South Sea island, would anyone care? Of course not. It was in its essence, it wasn't a pernicious doctrine. But then all sorts of things happened. Their ancestral homeland was not empty. That was a problem. That ancestral homeland was coveted by all the major powers for various reasons. The British wanted Palestine because it was the northern flank of the Suez Canal. They wanted to protect the Suez Canal. They wanted Palestine. It was also a step on the land bridge to India, Palestine. The Germans wanted Palestine. The French wanted Palestine. So now you have two elements which are alloying or contaminating a doctrine which was, I don't agree with it, but it was relatively harmless. And the two elements are, what do you do with the indigenous population? And in order to get a foothold in Palestine, because the Palestine movement was moneyless and powerless. It's just a bunch of Jews in Eastern Europe. The only way they could become a force, a political force to reckon with, they had to make deals with one of the great powers. Otherwise, how would they get into Palestine? So, Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, he visits the Germans, he visits the Ottomans, this is the era of imperialism, it's the late 19th century. So he's trying to cut a deal. And obviously there has to be a quid pro quo. If a great power backs if the great power backs the Zionist movement has to offer something. And what it offered was, we will be a bulwark of the West in Palestine. So without going through all the details, as you can see, the original idea, which you can disagree with, of course, but it was relatively innocuous. That means harmless. But it then started getting caught up in the practical sense. It starts getting caught up in an ugly underside. And the ugly underside was collusion with the European powers and a determination to rid Palestine of its indigenous population so as to enable its replacement by Jews the world over. That to me is Zionism. I don't think it has much to do with understanding the conflict today. You mentioned Professor Chomsky. I knew him quite well for 40 years. And of course, this question came up time and again. He was very adamant that he decided to be a Zionist at age 8, and nothing persuaded him otherwise right into ripe old age. But it was a particular kind of Zionism. It was called cultural Zionism. And cultural Zionism basically meant we need a center for Jewish culture which will enable it to thrive and experience a renaissance. In Professor Chomsky's home, you were not allowed to speak English. You could only speak Hebrew. His father, William Chomsky, he wrote a classic book on the joys of the Hebrew language. So he was very steeped in Hebrew culture. He told me this story that sometimes members of his extended family, they were so steeped in Hebrew culture that he said, an aunt, when she called down to the department store in Philadelphia, they were all in Philadelphia, they wanted to make a request to purchase something. She made the request in Hebrew. She had forgotten you have to speak English. So he was very close to that ideal of cultural Zionism. But obviously, that has nothing whatsoever to do with the realities today. I believe that when the head of the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories, his name was Haggai Elad. And there was a period about a decade ago or more already, about a decade ago, there was a whole debate within the human rights community as to whether or not Israel was an apartheid state. And Human Rights Watch produced a voluminous report. Amnesty International produced an even more voluminous report. And then there was B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. And they produced a report under the stewardship, the directorship of Haggai Elad. It was a relatively small report, but I thought it accurately captured the problem. It said, between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River, including the West Bank, Gaza, and the state of Israel, it said there's only one state. Let's stop kidding ourselves. There's only one state. And it said that state is built on the foundation of Jewish supremacy. That's the essence. That maybe there are different gradations in the state of Israel. Arabs are second or third class citizens. In the case of the West Bank, the Arabs are effectively living in an apartheid system. And in the case of Gaza, they were living in a concentration camp. So there were gradations. But the bottom line was Jews reigned supreme. Legally, economically, politically, it's a Jewish supremacist state. And that struck me as very simple and absolutely correct. So you don't have to introduce Zionism and read the tomes that I had read in order to write my doctoral dissertation. Everybody understands white supremacy. If you talk to Americans about white supremacy, they think of the American South, pre-civil rights era. If you think about white supremacy, you think about South Africa, a white supremacist state. So the idea of a Jewish supremacist state, it's not complicated, you understand.
Yeah.
It means where one side has all the rights and the other side has gradations of no rights. Okay? So, and Gideon Levy, the Israeli journalist, he's a very decent guy. He said at one point, fairly recently, he said, quote, Zionism means only one thing in the current world. It means Jewish supremacy. So I think we should steer away from terminology like Zionism, which embraces within its fold a Noam Chomsky and a Benjamin Netanyahu.
Right.
So it doesn't communicate a clear idea, and to use terminology which anyone understands and which actually is accurate. It's a Jewish supremacist state. It's also an obnoxious, self-righteous Jewish supremacist state, but Jewish supremacist, yes.
In chapter 1 of your book, I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, you say, does one's ethno-racial identity possess a vital essence to be protected and preserved? Or is it a fluke of nature that was instrumentalized to oppress and, in an ideal world, could potentially be eradicated as a social marker? Legacy media is fixated with asking pro-Palestinian supporters this one question: do you recognize Israel as a Jewish state? Mm-hmm. Even Zohran Mamdani was badgered with this question during the
answered
debate.
it excellently.
Yeah. Do you recognize Israel as a Jewish state? And what I don't get is the fixation with this question. Why is it so important to have a Jewish state? And like you brought up, why is it so important to even have an ethno-nationalist state? I had Vijay Prashad on this show earlier this year, and he spoke about how in India as well, there's a sentiment that the government is pushing towards a Hindu state or a Hindu Rashtra. And his counter is that countries thrive on secularism and complexity and diversity. Countries thrive when there's intermingling of culture and trade and food and values. Great cities like New York, San Francisco, London are built on this principle. America was built on this principle. It was built by immigrants coming in from Italy or Ireland or European Jews, Asians, South Americans. Cities and countries thrive when there's secularism. So is there any benefit to having a Jewish state or any benefit of having any ethno-nationalist state? You brought up Quebec and Spain as well.
Yeah, sure there is. Of course there is. And one would have to be very dogmatic to deny it. There's something nice about the ideal of, if you take what is white light? White light when you cut it with a prism. What's white light when you cut it with a prism? I'm asking you.
Splits out into colors.
A rainbow.
Rainbow.
Which do you prefer to look at? White light or a rainbow?
Rainbow.
Fine. So the notion of a multiplicity of nation states, each a different color, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, but of course,
Rainbow nation.
Yeah, rainbow nation. Yeah, that's a very good point. South Africa chose as its motto a rainbow nation. Now, it could have chosen as its motto, the communists, theirs was the red flag. It was one color. They chose the rainbow flag. So there's something enticing about that vision. There's certainly something to be admired in that vision. If you have one people, you'll probably end up having one language. Do you prefer a world that's polyglot? Or do you prefer a world where everybody speaks one language? Some people like the multiplicity of languages. Some people believe their language, Tolstoy couldn't have written in German, and Heine or Schiller couldn't have written in Russian. So there's something obviously enticing in that vision. And the abolition of nations has its price. The question is, to my thinking, as Bertrand Russell, you read at least something in my book on, this is the new edition. And Bertrand Russell writes at one point, we'll find it, don't worry. Here. Fortunately, we have a good index. Bertrand Russell writes, there are always good arguments on both sides of any real issue. There are good arguments for maintaining the reality of nation states and nationalities. But then there's the other side. And the other side is, it's very hard to separate out the preservation of nationalities from the preservation of national egos. And it's very difficult to separate out the preservation of national egos from the preservation of national hierarchies, as in we're better than them. And then you can follow the equation, and very quickly it degenerates into all sorts of xenophobic chauvinisms. And it might be the case that the only way to overcome those xenophobic chauvinisms, to really overcome them, is to eliminate the national ego. And I can see that argument. Then you have to decide, which do you think it's worth more to preserve? It plays itself out very simply in any local situation. Let's take the case of Jews, which I know better. So, right now, Jews are intermarrying at a rate of about 60%. Okay, they've gotten out of the ghetto. So if a Jew is in college, the likelihood is, of the 30 classmates, maybe one other or two others are Jewish. Okay? So if he's going to meet a mate, there's a very high probability that that person is not going to be Jewish, because Jews are only 2% of American society. All right? Now, if he or she marries the mate, then the likelihood that the child is going to identify as Jewish is very small. Why? Well, which would you rather celebrate, Christmas or Hanukkah? Christmas is a national holiday. You get Santa Claus. You get Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Hanukkah, you get what's called a dreidel. It's just, you have to choose. You're going to go with the mainstream culture. Jews being a minority. So sometimes in some Jewish communities, it's called the second Holocaust, this intermarriage. Because what Hitler didn't manage to do, this embracing culture has succeeded in doing, namely, next generation after intermarriage, only 30% identify as Jews and only 10% identify as Jews, and then Jews are gone. So I have friends, or I had friends, who didn't want, they were very open-minded, very liberal, the Barack Obama types. But they drew the line. They did not want their children to marry non-Jews because they wanted to preserve the Jewish tradition. They wanted to preserve the Jewish heritage. They wanted to preserve the Jewish culture. And they knew there was only a small probability that if they intermarried, the Jewish culture tradition would be preserved. I could see their argument. As Bertrand Russell said, there are always good arguments on both sides in any real issue. But I don't support it. Ultimately, I believe that love should triumph over all, and even if it's at the expense of preserving one's culture and tradition. And I do believe the national egoism in an ideal world has to be rid of.
There are good arguments on both sides, but on your side, you're definitely in good company because there are great men like Frederick Douglass, who was denounced by the Afrocentrics of his times for lacking in quote-unquote black pride. W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about how he was clutched by the unity beneath all of life. Even Edward Said echoed these sentiments in his memoir.
These are all very illustrative examples because Edward Said went through several metamorphoses. Originally, he was just an English professor.
Yeah.
He had no visible manifestations as a Palestinian. When the Third Worldism, as it was called, set in, beginning after World War II, with decolonization, the fact that what were called Third World countries were stepping forth, India, Egypt, Indonesia, they were stepping forth, then a notion of pride in one's nation among third world countries unfolded. And Professor Said sort of reinvented himself as a Palestinian. And then at the end of his life, he became a universalist again. His last major collaboration was with an Argentinian Jew, Barenboim. It was called the West-Eastern Divan, which was trying to create to rise above ethnic difference. So I think those are difficult questions. And I can't say who, in my opinion, handled them perfectly. I think everybody struggled with finding the right balance. I've struggled with finding the right balance.
Well, you're definitely in good company on this side of the scale. I want to bring it back to talking about how we can get people to snap out of their convictions and ideologies. And you have personal experience with this. When you were young, you used to believe in Maoism, Chairman Mao, live like him, dare to struggle, dare to win. And then you've said in the past that after the trial of Gang of Four, you were in such a state of shock that you were bedridden for many weeks because you had to digest the fact that you had been misled, that your convictions were wrong. Is that what it takes now that we're talking about Zionism, talking about Israel and the national project, them crossing a moral threshold? Is an event of the scale of the public trial of Netanyahu, is that what's going to take to convince them out of these convictions? Or are there smaller, easier ways?
Well, it depends on where you're talking about. Among American Jews, I think the younger generations have had enough with Israel. They don't really, it's not a marker on their map. Mamdani had to have gotten some of the younger Jewish vote, or he wouldn't have won. And he was pretty tough. He would not, even late in the campaign, where anybody else would have run away, he defended the slogan, globalize the intifada, And he wouldn't relent on the use of Israel as a Jewish state. He said Israel is a state, has the same rights as any state, and he said also the same responsibilities as any state. And he said, I support a state with equal rights. And interestingly, Mark Landler, who also ran in the mayoral campaign, he's Jewish. He has 2 sons. And they cross-endorsed each other. And they appeared together on the Colbert Show. I was very struck by that. Mamdani did not succumb to the intimidation, and Landler, a Jew with 2 Jewish sons, he made a point of publicly embracing, politically and personally, Mamdani. So it tells me, not as Bob Dylan said, the times are a-changing, the times have changed. The times have changed. They've changed in 2 senses. A breaking down of that solidarity with Israel, but also a incremental loss of power by the Jewish plutocrats. People like Bill Ackman, who led the campaign to depose, to oust Claudine Gay at Harvard during the encampment period, he very prominently led the campaign to stop Mamdani. He, along with Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, these are the Jewish supremacist billionaire class. And I don't know if you were in the city at the time, this past week. Were you here?
Nope.
If you looked at the homepage of the New York Times each morning, above the Times, there was a banner ad. And the ad was, we have to stop Mamdani. And it was brazenly signed. This ad was paid for by Michael Bloomberg, Bill Ackman, and DoorDash, the food deliverers. Usually you hide behind some pack with a Democrats for a safe Israel or something. No. And they pumped in just Bloomberg, $8.3 million to stop Mamdani. Ackman formally gave $500,000, I'm sure, under the table more, And he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. So it's not just the diminution in support among young people for Israel, but a cracks in the Jewish supremacist billionaire class. I was out canvassing, and as I said, the one neighborhood was Jewish. And the woman I said, so are you going to vote for Mamdani tomorrow? I'm here to try to persuade. Never. I said, why not? He's such a nice guy. He's an anti-Semite. And her face, she was like consumed by hate. And you know what struck me about that? She was the only one. Normally, forget what would happen. She was the only one. Otherwise, people were perfectly at home, perfectly at ease with Mamdani, notwithstanding and despite his public commitment, convictions, his principles on the question of the conflict. There he was better than Bernie. Bernie was a complicated situation because, first of all, Bernie comes from a generation where it's very hard at that age to suddenly see the light. Okay? He's Jewish. He's about 82 now, so he passed through the Nazi Holocaust in terms of time, that age cohort. And the founding of the State of Israel, and the kibbutzim, and the whole thing. And also Bernie was always very attentive to how far you can go before you lose your constituency. And he thought the furthest he could go was as far as he went, which was condemning Netanyahu, but standing firm on Israel as a Jewish state. Mamdani went further. Clearly, he went further. And he didn't just keep his constituency. The Landler support of him was... It kind of shocked me that Landler, he's a progressive, decent guy, that for sure, but that he would go out on that limb. Times have changed.
Times are changing.
No, they are changing, but they also have changed. There's been a Rubicon has been crossed that you can get a platform hostile to Israel and win the mayoralty in New York. New York City, largest concentration of Jews in the world outside of Tel Aviv, outside of Israel. It's something to behold, to observe, and to behold.
I think that's positive. Let's do one final big question, and then we'll start wrapping up. And keeping up with the theme, it's going to be another question I struggle with. And we have already established by all possible definitions of the word, I'm a layman when it comes to history of the conflict. And I used to believe, possibly naively, that Palestine is both the West Bank and Gaza. And now, maybe this is my ignorance, maybe this is just optics, or maybe it's genuinely tough to get legitimate news because legacy media has a bias. But my impression has been that the West Bank hasn't stood up for Gaza as much as you would expect them to. Now, even as much as, let's say, Lebanon has or South Africa has. And there are many directions we can take from here. But I think the historical context would be important first. So I want to talk about the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and Yasser Arafat. In the Lex Friedman debate, you said about Arafat, like the Mufti, never liked the guy. This is one of the only disagreements you had with Moin Rabbani about Yasser Arafat. So let's talk about that context. What was the PLO? Who was Arafat? And what role did they play in the West Bank?
I'm not a good person for that. I've never followed internal Palestinian politics. It never really interested me that much. On the first question or the first observation you made, Israel has always wanted to divide the West Bank from Gaza, divide and conquer. And credit given where credit due. They succeeded. You're obviously way too young to remember, but during the First Intifada, 1980, it's dated from December 7th, 1987. The First Intifada, it began in Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. And within the blink of an eye, it spread to the West Bank. And then there was what was called the Unified National Command. It didn't include back then Hamas. Hamas wouldn't join it, at least initially. I think later they did. Can't remember now the exact details. But it was one. Gaza was West Bank was Gaza. And it was also very easy to travel back then between the two. The hermetically sealing Gaza came much later. It came about 1990, what was called the
Policy of closure.
Closure, the policy of closure. And then by 2006, it became, even earlier, by 2004, the Israeli head of the National Security Council was describing Gaza as a concentration camp. But over time, they divided. Gaza was hermetically sealed from the West Bank, and two entities, I don't know if I should call them provisional entities, but two entities, at least provisional entities, came into being. And it was very striking, for example, during the Great March of Return that began March 30th, 2018. There was no support in the West Bank. Now, some people said because of the repression by the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority. That's true, but guess what? There was a lot of repression during the First Intifada, but people were willing to give their lives. I talked to Palestinians I know about that, and they said that, and there's truth to it, there's truth to the argument. They said Palestinians are not willing to give their lives because alive for what? There's no goal. There's no, you want to give full authority to the Palestinian, full control to the Palestinian Authority? Oh, thanks, but no thanks. You're not willing to die for nothing. So she said, yes, it's true people are afraid to die because the repression is formidable. But Palestinians have been willing in the past to sacrifice their lives for a cause. But now there's no cause. Mahmoud Abbas? No, that's not a cause. So they succeeded in their goal of dividing the West Bank from Gaza. It may prove to be ephemeral, and it may prove that a new movement will emerge that will unify the two places. But for now, look, the Israelis, they're not geniuses, but they have enough historical experience. And they calculate pretty well. They figured, look, every Arab state has a repressive army that does the bidding of the West, basically, and the ruling elite. So they figure, let's give Palestinians the right to police themselves. All we have to do is give them VIP status, slightly higher than average pay, make sure there's lots of unemployment so people are desperate for jobs, which means they'll serve in the police force or the secret services. And why can't we create a Jordanian army? The only difference is they won't get a state, but they'll get the trappings of power, and the trappings of privilege. So I remember when the Oslo Accord was signed, what was his name? Well, physicist Andoni, Professor Andoni, Ghassan Andoni. Everybody understood the Palestinians got nothing from Oslo. But he says, what's the difference? If Oslo falls apart, we'll have a 25,000 person army. He thought the army would fight for them. Well, guess what? The 25,000, the Israelis understood. We can buy them off, create this police force, and they'll do our bidding. Mamdani didn't see that. Who trained them? This Palestinian army. Who trained them? The Jordanians, the Egyptians. They trained them to be a quisling army. And they succeeded. So they thought ahead. We can do that. And who would have thought we could just buy off the PLO? Which they did.
You had called the PLO and Arafat subcontractors for
Well, they
Israel.
call them, everyone calls them that. They're subcontractors to Israel. Have you listened to Mahmoud Abbas's statements? All of his statements the past 20 months have been denouncing Hamas. Hamas has to leave. Hamas is the cause of all the troubles. Hamas is responsible for the mess we're in now. Hamas. They only care about their bank accounts. Really, that's not being cynical. That's just being factual. Their only concern is their bank accounts. So I think, the Israelis managed it well. And they seem to have succeeded in Gaza. But you never know. You never know. Look, tell me a year ago that a Democratic Socialist was going to win in New York City. Out of your mind. And then miracles happen.
Well, I hope times change, in the words of Bob Dylan. Before we wrap up, I want to get your thoughts on the future of Gaza. During the Iranian Revolution, a left group wrote on the walls of the Ministry of Justice, Dar tulu-e azadi, jai azadi khali. Freedom has come, but freedom is empty. Even if the genocide stops tonight, how long will it take for Gaza to recover, if
It
at
can't
all?
recover.
Have we lost Gaza forever?
That's what the facts state. And I'm not going to go beyond the facts. The facts state that it would take 15 to 20 years to rebuild Gaza. There are 50 million tons of rubbish, of rubble in Gaza. That's what the facts state. Now, can miracles happen? I find it implausible, but I have to leave a part of my mind open to that possibility. And I don't really care. I mean, at this point in my life, I do what I do because it's the right thing to do, regardless of whether you win or lose. It's like your whole being revolts against the horror that's unfolding, and you do everything in your power to stop the horror from unfolding. And if it can succeed, it can succeed. You still do it. I mean, when I went out and campaigned for Zohran Mamdani, the difference between my age and the next person was about 50 years. It's like, Norm, Mamdani might be mayor and you'll already be dead. You know? Why do you do it? Because that's my purpose. To do nothing goes against every grain of my being. So I don't really care if it's hopeless. It doesn't change anything for me. You just keep struggling. And every once in a while, you'll be hit with a surprise, like yesterday. And you realize all the calculations in the world can still be wrong. I had a friend who I went out with. Her name is Carrington Moore. And about 5 or 6 months ago, she said to me, she's in DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, which Mamdani isn't. She said to me, so what do you think of Zohran Mamdani? I said, who is he? Oh, she said, he's a smart guy and he's so charismatic. And I'm thinking, oh, God. another one of those types, daydreaming. She was right. She was right. My publisher, Colin Robinson, he said to me, he's older than me. He said to me, I think Mamdani's going to win. I said, why do you think that? He said, because he's British. He said, because I saw with Jeremy Corbyn how if you have an army of committed people knocking on doors, it can change all calculations. It could change all calculations. And I have to say, I was skeptical, as I told you. From my experiences, I thought, no, he's going to lose 2 out of every 3 neighborhoods. He can't win. He was right. So, the expression, it's always attributed to the Italian revolutionary Antonio Gramsci, but it's actually Romain Rolland, this French writer. A pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. The facts, pessimism, look at the sober facts. But there's always the possibility of will, optimism of the will. So I'm pessimism of the intellect. I can't say I have optimism of the will, but I will say sometimes the optimism does happen. I don't know when this interview is going to be aired, and it's quite possible Mamdani won't win in November. The powers that be are going to make it very tough. But it's another step along the way.
The final scene of the Sergei Eisenstein movie, spoiler alert, Strike, is a scene of this field of Russian corpses and dead bodies, and it's likened to the slaughter of cattle. And then the movie ends with the words, "Remember, proletarians."
Proletarians? Exclamation point. Remember! Exclamation point. Yeah, that stuck with me.
If the facts state that Gaza's lost forever, then the least we can do is remember it. And I think you're one of the few people, unfortunately, but you're one of the few people who's doing so much work to keep that memory alive. What do you think is going to happen in the Middle East, given everything we've spoken about over the last 2 conversations, in the next 10 or 15 years? Israel?
No, I'm going to cut you short.
No predictions.
I couldn't tell you what's going to happen in the next hour. I couldn't tell you what's going to happen in the next hour. I think I got a lot of things right. If you followed my commentary over the last 20 months, I think I got a lot more right than anybody else from hard work and study over a long period of time. I also got a lot of things wrong. I didn't think Hezbollah would be so easily decapitated. I was wrong about that. I got a lot of things wrong. But I think I got a lot more right than anybody else. If you go back and you listen to my very first interviews I did after October 7th, you listen, I wouldn't have to change very much. When I was going out and saying it's a genocide, and I wouldn't have to change much. I don't think I'd have to change anything. I mean, I've withstood time, but not because I'm a genius. I work hard. And for everybody else, what was new and startling and revelatory, for me, it was old news. Of course, things changed, But in general, I got things right. But I couldn't tell you what's going to happen in the next hour. I have no idea.
Instead of a prediction, if events continue on this trajectory that we are on, where do we end up?
Honestly, I don't know what the trajectory is.
Okay.
It looked like it was going to be a massive escalation, and then something. So all of a sudden, somebody said to me, "Did you know Trump announced a ceasefire 20 minutes ago?"
Right.
Where did that come from? He's a very erratic figure, and it's impossible to predict, in my opinion. So I will forego predictions.
Okay.
Okay.
Final question.
Oh, I feel it.
In your book, Gaza and Inquest Into Its Martyrdom, you say, if he who pays the piper calls the tune, then no one paid this piper, and so he was free to call his tune. When you look back on your life, what would you like your legacy to be? How do you want to be remembered?
I say it in every email to every person who writes me. I did my best, which is the best that I can do.
Your students made a t-shirt for you once with a line from John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, which said that so few now dare to be eccentric marks the chief danger of our time. And we started our conversation talking about optimism. And even now, there's a light of hope. You nearly gave up hope in 2020. You thought the pursuit was hopeless, but you came back and you've shared a story that I find really powerful that I want to share as we close out. Last year, you were at a demonstration in Washington Square Park and there were over 50,000 people. I think it was pouring rain. You've said most of the people were less than half your age. You were in a category of one. And for hours while it was pouring, people were chanting and singing. And after the demonstration ended, everyone went down to the subway tracks. And as they were standing on opposite sides of the subway tracks, they were still chanting and singing. And you said this was a really powerful moment because here there were young kids in New York, born into privilege, standing up for kids in an Arab ghetto in the Middle East. Even in the civil rights movement, people were standing up for themselves. But here you have people who are so many degrees detached from the hardship faced by these children, and yet they're standing up for what's right. And I think there's a lot of optimism and hope that can be derived from that. Vietnam was one of the salient movements of your generation. Palestine is ours, and you're one of the few people keeping the torch burning. So it's a rich legacy that you leave behind. Professor, if people want to support you, if they want to read your books, if they want to help you in any way, what is the best way to find you, find your work, or support you?
I have an old friend of mine, comrade of mine, Sana Qasim. She's a chemist, Palestinian. She's in Greece, Athens. And she's in charge of all my social media, about which I know nothing. And so she keeps it updated. So just look in the social media, affiliate with my name, and we keep things pretty much on. They're on time.
Professor, thank you so much. It's been a privilege for me. Thank you for your time and the conversation.
Well, thank you so much.